Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ken Lykens, and I'm here representing AWWA, and I'm the chair of AWWA's Water Utility Council. I want to start off by thanking KWWA for the invite to come to the conference and speak to you all. The topic that I was asked to speak about today was the Inflation Reduction Act and its impact on U.S. water utilities. And as I was putting the paper together, I realized I needed to modify that topic because, as you'll hear in my presentation, the Inflation Reduction Act really had very little impact on water utilities, and there wasn't very much funding available for them. So I've broadened the presentation somewhat, and hopefully it'll hit the mark with what you're looking for today. I mentioned that I'm the chair of the Water Utility Council for AWWA, and what that is it's a group of 25 water professionals from across the country, mainly general managers, CFOs, executive level folks in utilities that work with our Washington, D.C. staff to help set federal regulatory policy and also lobby on legislation in D.C. Before I get started with the presentation, I need to give you a little bit of background on all of the federal funding that's happened coming out of Washington since COVID. Right after COVID hit, there were actually 3 rounds of stimulus that were directed at American taxpayers. These were direct stimulus payments. It started with the CARES Act in March of 2020. COVID was brand new, and that was $300 billion that was given directly to taxpayers. The Tax Relief Act in December of 2020, another $150 million, or $150 billion, I'm sorry. And the American Rescue Plan in March of 2021 for another $400 billion. So I mention all that because the industry in America said, well, you're giving all of these payments directly to taxpayers, but you're not really helping the industrial sector. So can't we put together some funding at the federal level to help stimulate infrastructure and the economy in a more lasting, sustainable way? Excuse me. In 2021, Congress passed what was called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA. It was also called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or BIL. So if you know anything about American politics, the federal government loves acronyms, and there's a lot of them here. For the remainder of this presentation, I'm just going to refer to the IIJA. So the genesis of the IIJA actually started back in 2008 and 2009 during the financial crisis, the global financial crisis. And for you that are familiar, Obama was in office at that time. Obama and the Congress passed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, and the buzzword associated was that this money, about $1 trillion, was intended for shovel-ready projects. So shovel-ready projects means that the design had already been completed, the planning, the design, the permitting, and you were basically ready to go to construction. Well, that eliminated a vast majority of projects, and the whole impetus behind that law fizzled because there weren't enough projects that met the criteria to get this $1 trillion of financing into the economy. So starting in 2008, 2009, both political parties campaigned and advocated for a large infrastructure law that would actually start with the planning process and the typical process that we go through with engineers. And it really didn't take shape and get passed until 2021 with the IIJA. So the IIJA authorized $1.2 trillion for a wide variety of infrastructure projects. $650 billion of that money was for projects and spending that had already been identified and Congress was planning to spend money on, but actually hadn't been authorized by Congress. So the remaining $550 million was directed towards new infrastructure projects, and that's what you see up here on the screen. I won't go through all of these numbers, but I'll just point out that a little over half of the money was for transportation projects, and about 10% of the $550 billion was directed to water. Now, since I've been a water guy for most of my career, I always get upset when we have to play second fiddle to the transportation sector. But it really comes down to the fact that visible projects, streets, roads, bridges, parks, stuff that the public can see always seems to get the lion's share of the funding. I'm sure all of you have some of the same experience. So this pie chart is a breakdown of that $55 billion for water that I just mentioned, and that was the water sector as a whole. And the breakdown is $15 billion for lead service line replacements. That's a big issue in the United States right now. We're trying to get all the lead service lines out of utilities in the next 10 years. $11 billion for drinking water state revolving fund. That's probably a new term to a lot of people here. I'll explain what a revolving fund is in a minute. Another $11 billion for the clean water state revolving funds. That's the wastewater side of the house. And then $10 billion to address emerging contaminants, primarily PFAS. Okay, now let me talk to you a little bit about what the state revolving funds are. In the 1980s, Congress and the states set up a program where on an annual budget process, Congress would dedicate as part of EPA's budget to the states an annual capitalization grant. And those capitalization grants would go to a state administrator. It's a different agency within each state. And then the states match that money coming from the federal government by 20%. That revolving fund is used for loans for water, well, in the beginning wastewater, but then they also duplicated it for drinking water, for utilities to apply to the state for low interest loans. Those loans are issued so utilities can do their projects, and then the payment stream comes back to the revolving fund, and that's where the terminology revolving comes from. And conceptually or theoretically, that pot of money continues to grow over time. It doesn't always happen. So the whole point of this that you need to understand is it's not free money. It's a loan that has to be paid back. And the loan comes with a lot of strings and red tape associated with it. Utilities sometimes shy away from the revolving funds because of the red tape. Federal reporting, Buy America, Build America. That's an initiative and a requirement of the IIJA, where if you take the revolving fund money, you have to demonstrate that a vast majority of the goods and services used to build your projects are coming from the U.S., and you all know we're a global economy when it comes to water projects, so that's very difficult. And there's also prevailing wage requirements and a lot of other things that I don't have time to go into detail right now. Another attribute of the state revolving funds is that states have to provide to EPA on an annual basis what's called a needs assessment. So what they do is they go out to all of the utilities within their state and they ask them, what do you think you're going to need to spend to renew your infrastructure over the next 20 years? So this pie chart here was done in 2021, and if you add up all of those numbers on the pie chart, you get a little over $600 billion worth of needs from all the states that they reported in their needs assessment. So the total pie is over $600 billion. You divide that by 20 years and you get $30 billion a year of needs, and the IIJA provided $35 billion for drinking water projects over 5 years, or $7 billion a year. You can see there's a big gap between what the utilities say they need and what was provided by the IIJA. Now, if it sounds like I'm praising and criticizing the IIJA at the same time, you're probably hearing me correctly. Okay, so how was AWWA involved? AWWA was heavily involved in identifying what the infrastructure needs for the U.S., especially in drinking water, were after the 2008-2009 financial crisis and the fizzle of the shovel-ready projects. So we engaged from the very beginning, and anytime any kind of legislation starts to move forward, we're out there talking to congressmen and senators about including money into the federal legislation to take care of those needs. In 2012, we commissioned a study to do what is the need for water utilities over the next 25 years, and that came in over $1 trillion. The report also estimated that more than $60 billion was going to be required for lead service replacements. And again, this kind of shows the disparity between the needs and what was actually approved by the IIJA. Again, there's also a discrepancy between the numbers that I talked about on the previous page, the $600 billion over 20 years and the $1 trillion over 25 years. It all depends on who's doing the study, who's asking the questions, and how they count up the needs. So what's the road ahead look like? The funds from the IIJA are authorized through 2026. There's many different federal agencies that are involved with distributing this money for the different sectors, the infrastructure sectors. The primary ones with the lion's share of the money are the Department of Transportation, the Department of Energy to update the electrical grid in the United States, and I've already talked about US EPA, and they're distributing the water and the wastewater money. This chart was actually put together by Congress after the IIJA, right after the IIJA was signed. And what they showed was that it was going to take them about 8 months to start distributing the money after the bill was signed. In actuality, that turned out to be over a year. And why did it take so much time? Well, a few reasons. The states weren't prepared to receive this large influx of money because it had been more money that they had ever seen before in their programs, and they had to sit down and review their procedures, get additional staff, and they had a lot of preparation to do to properly administer the funds. COVID was still lingering, and COVID presented staffing and communication challenges from EPA to the states and then into the utilities. And then once the money came in the door to the states actually had to go out and market utilities to explain to them, we've got this large sum of money that needs to be used, and encourage them to apply for the SRF loans. I personally am the general manager for a utility in Colorado, and when these funds came in, my board asked me to go apply for them to help offset some of the costs associated with our project. And after a couple weeks of discussion, I discovered that we were already too far down the design road. You have to submit your plans to the states at the 60% design level. We were already at 90%. And then after you submit your plans, it takes them up to 6 months to review and approve your project to receive funding from the state revolving funds. and we didn't have that additional 6 months in our schedule. We had a critical hard deadline we had to meet. So that's just one example of some of the obstacles that utilities run into when they try and take advantage of this federal funding. Okay, so where are we now? Since 2022, EPA has provided about $22 billion in IIJA funds for water infrastructure projects. $10 billion for drinking water, $6 billion for wastewater, $6.5 billion for lead service line replacements, and there's some rumors that there's going to be some additional monies this year for more lead service line replacements because it's such a priority in the U.S. right now. So we're nearing the halfway point. I said earlier that 2026 the legislation runs out, and we've spent approximately half the money. So we're on track, or it appears that we're on track. Now I'll get to the Inflation Reduction Act, and I just discussed from 2021 or 2020 to 2021, we had 3 rounds of stimulus payments to taxpayers for around $1 trillion. And from 2021 to 2022, we had the IIJA money for another $1 trillion. And in 2022, inflation in the U.S. really started to tick up. And I'm not an economist, but I do pay attention to the financial news, and I often hear that the cause of inflation in the U.S. and probably a lot of other parts of the world is caused by too many dollars chasing too few goods and services. So Congress said we need to do something, and they put together the Inflation Reduction Act. Well, what did the Inflation Reduction Act do? It approved more spending, another $1 trillion. And what was that $1 trillion for? It was for clean energy projects, climate change, the Affordable Care Act, which is a health care act in the U.S., also called Obamacare, and modernizing the Internal Revenue Service. So one of the ways that they sold this legislation was they didn't think that the federal government was efficient enough at collecting taxes, so they were going to give more money to the IRS so they could bring more revenues in. Now, with all that said, there were some items that are environmental related, and they're up here on the screen. I'll just talk about a couple of them that are more directly water related. Drought response in the western United States, where I live, along the Colorado River, is in extreme drought right now. So the federal government is going to spend about $4 billion on that under the Inflation Reduction Act. And there's some water supply projects, $550 million, mainly for native tribes in the U.S. to get them reliable water supply. But the takeaway here is none of these funds were allocated to the SRF mechanisms that I talked about earlier with the IIJA. So just to wrap up, this is a picture of when President Biden signed the IIJA. And we as water professionals were very excited about that because even though it has a lot of red tape and strings, it is the biggest influx of money we've seen into the SRF since they were created in the 80s and 90s. But the funding doesn't come close to the needs that we have in the U.S. to rejuvenate our infrastructure. Next month in April, AWWA is having their annual fly-in, where we have about 200 water professionals that come into DC. We spend a day giving them briefing and talking points on various issues that we want them to talk to their elected officials about. They fan out across Capitol Hill, they talk to their elected officials, and it really helps the Water Utility Council and our government affairs staff get some leverage to get some of the legislation we want to see passed for water and wastewater utilities. One of our talking points is going to be more money for the SRFs. We're going to ask for an additional $3 billion for each of the SRFs, both the drinking water side and the wastewater side. So that's what I have to share with you today, and look forward to hearing any questions that you might have in the Q&A session.